Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Distribution of the Blessed Bread by J. Augustus Shea. How pleasant are thy fields, O France, and rich the land when nature fills the vineyards on thy purple hills, and vintage girls with sun-eyed glance awake the spirit of the morn with merry chorus, such as earth when music to the world was born woke over the sweet enchanter's birth, when birds from every bough they meet trill to the sun their wood notes sweet, filling the pauses with their song, while laughter light and converse gay make echo as they pass along as merry as a marriage day, when time and care, who over the earth travel, it is believed, together, forget the mission of their birth, and round the vine hills, led by mirth, follow the gleam of fancy's feather. But there, O France, are other times, when not less pleasant are thy fields, when sweetly call the convent chimes, and to their spell the spirit yields, while from each point within their sound the old and young are gathering round, and hopes, but now the gay ideal, become the everlasting real, and many meet in joy of prayer to seek with humble heart the throne, to be in charity sincere, and thus to know as they are known, in brotherhood of charity, the greatest of the virtues three. The matron was infirm and old, and may not join the sacred rite, but one of the domestic fold, with joyous heart and footstep light, the young and blooming cottage child went churchward forth at earliest dawn, gay as the flowers that round him smiled, in their first life over hill and lawn, the feast of love to join and share, before the holy place to stand, and homeward bring the treasure rare, the symbol bread of God's command. The Benediction. Bless this bread, O Lord, 'tis given in the special name of heaven, not the body to sustain, child of dust and heir of pain, but to strengthen for the skies that which never, never dies, symbol bread for sinners here, which by memory strengthens grace, lifts the spirit from this sphere over the firmamental space, where the everlasting lies, to whose land of light and flowers the approach was paradise, ere the fascinator's eyes lured from heaven this earth of ours. Let this bread the symbol be of the love of man the brother, universal unity mid the children of one mother, that whatever our banquet here, he who wants may claim a share. Let its fond memorial nourish, bounded by nor creed nor clime, virtue till its branches flourish, far above the realms of time. In thy name, O God of love, share we this memorial feast, that we live with thee above, of thy servants even the least. Hear our supplication lowly, God of nations high and holy. Thus prayed the pastor on that day, the festal of the Agape. Around the altar's holy place innumerous lights their lustre spread, and flowers in many a marble vase an atmosphere of odour shed. In sacerdotal garb arrayed, with aged locks of reverend white, the priest a blessing sung and prayed before the altar's heaven of light. And down the crowded aisle he passed, the aisle of thousand worshippers, whom the small voice, loud as the blast, from archangelic trumpet stirs, to holiest life, and cherub boys, white vestured, bear the blessed food, that all should taste in it the joys of universal brotherhood. 'Twas now the golden close of day, the full-orbed sun was in the west, and the calm daylight, ray by ray, was fast retiring to its rest, when twilight dews come gently down, and diadem the valley flower, bright as the gems on monarch's crown, in all his pageantry of power, when lighter breezes down the hill dance with a more elastic measure, and from its woodland home the rill times with its song the bounding pleasure. 'Twas at that hour, of hours most holy, through the wild flowers as fair as wild, along the hill path travelling slowly, returned the joyous cottage child, bearing upon his homeward way the bread gifts from the agape, the love feast of the olden time, when beauteous from the Saviour's hand the Christian world was in its prime, and went the mandate forth sublime, love one another, through the land. Arrayed in garb of altar white, the emblem of unsullied truth, returned that stripling down the height, like to some heaven descended youth, into the happy cottage home. And thou mightst not unjustly deem that through the room from porch to dome entered with him a sacred beam of joy and bliss from heaven, that stole into the beauty of the soul, dispersed the shades of earthly care, and showed that heaven indeed was there. The young and old received the bread. The child, well taught how grace could save, repeated as the father said, who softly with uncovered head a portion to the matron gave. And there the household hearts renewed to each God's bond of brotherhood. Oh, what a lesson in that deed! Oh, what a sacred bond was plighted! Oh, what a gift to sinners need, in hearts refreshed and souls united! As heavenward went the voice of love to him, the babe of Bethlehem, the manger born, who from above, crowned with the Godhead's diadem, now cometh in the midst of them, for they, with hearts of heavenly flame, have met together in his name. Holy, holy, holy ever, be that hymn of love the nighest to our lips, forgotten never. Still Hosanna in the highest, let it like a mighty river ever flow to God the giver. Sinner, sing it as thou sighest, sing it mortal as thou diest, still Hosanna in the highest. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, Caroline Howard, A Story of the Revolution. It may not be unnecessary to state that throughout our revolutionary struggle, the conflicting interests and feelings of two great political parties agitated this country from Lake Champlain to Georgia, that intestine commotions and divisions distracted the operations of the disbelievers in regal and parliamentary supremacy, and that, in addition to the horrors ordinarily attendant on defensive war, the friends of civil and religious liberty had to contend in many instances with neighbors, friends, and brothers. The war which secured our independence, as is well known, was waged for a long time with but precarious prospects of a fortunate termination. Many intelligent and honest men doubted the practicability of such a disjunction. Others entertained an affection almost filial for the mother country and regarded with parricidal horror all endeavors to sever this branch from the parent stock, and others, still from pusillanimous or mercenary motives, remained inert and kept aloof, awaiting the issue of the contest under a conviction that whoever gained the ascendancy they could unite with the dominant power, and thus preserve their lives and property from hazard. There were not wanting those also who advocated the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. They conceived the prerogative of the king to be indisputable, and believed that any edict promulgated by Parliament and sanctioned by the royal signature was entitled to implicit obedience. This class of politicians were designated by their opponents as Tories. They, however, applied to themselves the less opprobrious epithet of Loyalists. On the other hand, those who, actuated by the pure spirit of patriotism, strenuously resisted injurious oppression, were stigmatized as rebels and proscribed as traitors. The concurrent causes which moved the latter so as to take such immediate and efficient interest in this momentous conflict have been fully detailed by our historians, but may well be glanced at here. At the close of the French War in 1775, The national debt of Great Britain amounted to nearly 150 millions sterling, for which an enormous sum was annually paid as interest. While the British ministry were digesting schemes for reducing this intolerable burden, they conceived the idea of creating a permanent revenue in the colonies from imposts to be levied by the English Parliament. Great Britain argued that the late contest originated on account of the American colonies, that it was right, especially as it had ended in a manner so conducive to their interests, that they should assist in liquidating the expenses they had accrued. To this proposition the provincials were willing to accede, provided they could be represented in the Parliament. They believed the chief excellence of the British Constitution to consist in guaranteeing to the subject a voice in the enactment of those laws by which he was to be governed. The Parliament considered it as the climax of contumacy for the colonists to refuse obedience to laws which in England were received with unhesitating submission, and to the rigorous and impolitic measures adopted by the King and his ministers to enforce these laws and to quell the turbulent and refractory spirit of the American people may be attributed the emancipation of those United States from the thraldom of British tyranny. Throughout the greater part of the campaign of 1776, and subsequent to the evacuation of New York by the American troops under General Washington, the prospects of liberty exhibited a saddening gloom. The Continental Army, consisting only of a few thousand men, and those destitute of clothing and every convenience of life, was reduced to a cipher when compared with the disciplined ranks of England. After the signal victories of Trenton and Princeton, new life and vigor was infused into the breasts of the almost despairing friends of freedom, and the capture of Lieutenant General Burgoyne at Saratoga in 1777, whose talents were well known and whose enterprising spirit and thirst for military renown could scarcely be equaled, while it excited the Americans to great efforts by affording them hopes of ultimate success, confirmed the wavering and heightened the embarrassment of the English ministry, who had so vainly endeavored to enslave the colonists. On a fine afternoon during the interesting period last mentioned, two horsemen were slowly winding their way along the road which leads to the town of Ridgefield. They were both young, and their appearance such as would ensure them attention in any society. The eldest was near 28 in stature, approaching the colossal, with quick piercing eyes, a neck firm and erect, chest expanding, shoulders square and muscular, arms long, no cumbrous flesh about the body, but the whole frame braced with well compacted sinews. Add to this a soldier-like bearing, a huge epaulette on his right shoulder, and other corresponding equipments, matchless skill and address in managing a strong black charger, and you will have an accurate idea of a continental officer. The other was 2 or 3 years younger than his companion, and of less powerful dimensions, but of well-knit, sinewy limbs, and calculated to endure great hardships and privations. The beast he bestrode was a mettlesome Narragansett nag that pawed the earth and caracoled to all sides of the road almost at once, evidently disliking the snail-like pace at which his rider held him. The conversation of the riders, which partook deeply of the spirit of the times, was renewed as the horses came abreast of each other in a wider pass of the road. "Even now," said he on the black horse, "I have the most undoubted reasons for believing there are confederacies existing, the object of which is to displace Washington and put in his place the Englishman Gates." "Admitting such to be the fact, Captain Edwards," said the other, "what objections have you to urge against the hero of Saratoga?" "Why, Sir, Gates lacks every requisite which ought to characterize a commander-in-chief. The only quality which he possesses is a brutal, dare-devil courage, which a general officer had better want than have." "But," resumed the other, "is not your favorite Washington deficient in spirit and energy?" "I tell you, Lieutenant Brown," rejoined Captain Edwards rather impetuously, "that Horatio Gates will no more compare with George Washington in mental energy and military science than Lord Cornwallis with the Duke of Marlborough. Greene is infinitely superior to Gates, and in the event of the death of Washington, but such a calamity may Heaven avert, he alone, I believe, could conduct our intricate affairs to a fortunate result, and the victory of Saratoga, where all your hero's laurels were won, was gained more by the valor, address, and experience of Arnold, Brooks, and Morgan than by any skill on the part of General Gates." "This I cannot grant," said the subaltern. Arnold, Brooks, and Morgan were undoubtedly brave, accomplished, and gallant officers, but their orders all originated with their commander, and consequently the capture of Burgoyne must have been the effect of the deep-laid plans and skilful manoeuvring of General Gates. "I perceive," returned the captain, "that this is a subject on which we shall never agree, and its discussion may elicit offensive observations, and, if you please, we will discontinue it entirely." "With all my heart," said Lieutenant Brown, "but it is now some time past meridian, and I think a little aliment might tend to benefit the animal system. We are but a short ride from the house of Mrs. Humphreys, and she will be happy to furnish refreshment and shelter to 2 soldiers of liberty." "Indeed," said the lieutenant, laughing, "report says that the dwelling of that lady possesses attractions for the gallant captain, independent of the good cheer afforded by the hospitable mistress of the mansion." "I do not understand you, sir," said the captain, drawing himself up somewhat haughtily. "Why, to be plain, captain," said Brown, "'tis said that the bright eyes of the fair niece of Mrs. Humphreys are the cause of your frequent visits to her house." "Though I highly esteem Miss Howard," said the captain coldly, "I permit no one to indulge themselves in such freedom as to associate my name with that of any lady." "But," rejoined the lieutenant, "you must allow that the smiles of this beautiful and accomplished girl have had their influence on your past conduct." "I cannot admit any such inference, nor will the premises justify this conclusion." As the colloquy ended, the horsemen spurred onward, and soon arrived in view of the residence of Mrs. Humphreys, which was situated on a gentle acclivity, accessible by a long avenue, skirted on either side with tall poplars, and defended at the extremity by a slight wooden gate. On entering this avenue, old Scipio came running toward them with a brow darkened a number of shades by his agitation, and grasping the bridle of Captain Edwards' horse, exclaimed, "Oh, for heaven's mercy, good Master Edwards, don't go to the house!" "What the devil's the matter?" ejaculated the captain, as he endeavored to disengage the hold of the negro. "Mistress has gone clean 'stracted," began the African, "because young Miss Caroline—" "What of her? Speak out, in the fiend's name!" said Captain Edwards, evincing much greater emotion than he had hitherto betrayed. "You stop me, sir. I must tell my story in my own way," said Scipio. "Proceed with it, then, with a murrain to you," said Lieutenant Brown, impatiently, "or by heaven, I'll beat it out of you with the flat of my sword." "Well, then," said the negro, angrily, "the Tory Captain Lewis came to our house last night with some sodgers, and carried off Miss Caroline." "The young hung villain!" muttered Captain Edwards, from between his clenched teeth, and then compelling himself to speak more calmly, he said, "Brown, my dear fellow, return directly to the camp, and meet me at Stoffels Tavern, with Sergeant Watkins and a dozen trusty soldiers. The scoundrel cannot escape me. I know every Tory haunt between here and the Hudson. I must go to the house and console the afflicted Mrs. Humphreys." The subaltern struck his spurs into the flank of his steed, and hastened to execute the orders of his superior. The captain rode up the lane, saying to himself, "I always knew that Lewis was a consummate rascal, but this daring outrage almost passes belief, and what object the wretch can expect to accomplish I cannot conceive. Caroline has the spirit of Elizabeth of England, and all attempts to gain her love by possessing himself of her person will only excite her contempt, and if he dares even to meditate an injury to that loveliest of her sex, his life shall pay the forfeit." He had now reached the house, and throwing his bridle to a servant, entered without ceremony. As he had anticipated, he found Mrs. Humphreys in an indescribable state of grief. Her health was delicate, and this unexpected calamity had prostrated her physical and mental energies. After offering a few encouraging words, which produced but a very slight effect, he remounted his horse and rode rapidly to the place of rendezvous. Here he met Lieutenant Brown, a sergeant, corporal, and 10 privates, all finely armed and equipped, and prepared to brave any danger and incur any hazard in the service of a commander in whom they had the most unbounded confidence. He instantly placed himself at their head, and proceeded on his expedition. It was now dark. Their road lay along the margin of a small stream, bounded on the one side by half-cultivated fields, and on the other by a thick, gloomy forest, in which the death-like silence of its dark bosom was only broken by the occasional howl of its savage tenants. After pursuing their course for some distance along the bank of this rivulet, now traversing the ground on its very margin, and then again carried by the windings of the path miles from the stream, they came to a sharp angle in the road, on turning which the captain, being a short distance in advance of the troops, discovered a figure slightly defined, but yet bearing some resemblance to the human species, stealing along the side of the path, apparently wishing to avoid observation. Striking his spurs into his horse, and drawing his sword at the same time, the captain had the person completely in his power before the other had time to offer either flight or resistance. "For whom are you?" was demanded by Captain Edwards in no gentle accents. "I'm nay, just free to say," replied the stranger thus rudely interrogated, with a true Caledonian evasion. "Answer me at once," returned the captain. "Which party do you favour?" "Ye might have the civility to give me a gentle hint which side ye belang to," said Sawney. "No circumlocution," rejoined the soldier, sternly. "Inform me immediately, are you a mercenary of the tyrant of England, or a friend to liberty? Your life depends on your answer." "Aweel, then," said the Scotchman firmly, "sin ye will have it, by my saul, I won't go to heaven with a lie in my mouth. I'm Whig to the backbone, ye Caroline. Now do your worst, and be hanged till ye." Well pleased was the American captain to discover so staunch a friend, when he had every reason to expect an enemy, and after furnishing him with a pistol, and advising him to avoid the scouting parties of the enemy by keeping in the wood, he again proceeded on his expedition. They soon reached a fork in the road. One branch led into the recesses of the wood, and the other lay still farther along the banks of the stream, when the captain, calling Lieutenant Brown a little distance from the troop, said, "A few miles' ride will carry us to the encampment of a party of these Tories. I wish to reconnoitre the position of the enemy, and shall take the road which leads into the wood for that purpose, while you with the soldiers will ride on the other road till you arrive within sight of the enemy, and then return to this point, which shall be our place of rendezvous. In the meantime, I wish you to avoid coming to any engagement with the Tories, but in case you hear me fire 2 pistol shots, you may believe me to be in danger, and hasten to my relief." To command was to be obeyed with Captain Edwards, and soon no sound was heard, save the slow and regular tread of the horses of the soldiers under command of Lieutenant Brown. Leaving the Republican soldiers for a time, we now turn our attention to the partisan Tory, who had entered the house of Mrs. Humphreys like a robber, and forcibly carried off Miss Howard. James Lewis was a loyal officer of much celebrity, of English extraction, and bred in the principles of entire acquiescence in the orders of the British ministry. He beheld the struggles of the aggrieved colonists with contempt. He saw the inhabitants rising about him in various parts of the country with feelings of bitter malignancy, and he determined to exert himself to the utmost to crush these evidences of rebellion in the outset. Moved by this inveteracy, he accepted a captain's commission in the English army, and fought for a time under the banners of General Clinton, with success worthy of a better cause. But taking offense at some imperious order of his commander, he threw up his commission in disgust, and retired to his native village near the river Hudson. Here, collecting about him a few choice spirits like himself, he kept the inhabitants in a continual state of alarm by his plundering and rapacious conduct. Acting, as he pretended, under the orders of the king, the Tories durst not oppose him, and the Whigs were too few in numbers to resist his foraging excursions with any prospect of success. In his youth he had been a school companion of Captain Edwards, but their principles were widely dissimilar, and little intercourse had taken place between them. In after life they embraced different sides, and the Tory disliked the Whig for his virtues, and envied him his good name. In one of his marauding expeditions he became acquainted with Miss Howard, and discovering the interest the Republican had in her affections, he determined to get her into his power for the purpose of holding a check on the Whig officer whom he equally feared and hated. A libertine in principle and a profligate in practice, he scrupled at no means to attain his object, and a violent attack on the peaceful dwelling of a defenceless woman was as consonant with his views as robbing a hen roost. The dwelling of this renegade was situated on a small elevation on the bank of the river Hudson. His peculiar occupation and the state of affairs in the country had rendered it necessary for him to fortify and strengthen his house, and at the time referred to it resembled what it in fact was, the rendezvous of a band of lawless desperadoes. In the principal room of the building was the villain captain with 3 of his officers seated round a decayed deal table, playing cards. On one end of the table stood a dirty decanter, partly filled with apple brandy. 3 or 4 cracked, dingy tumblers were scattered over the table, and the rest of the furniture of the apartment was in keeping with what has been described. In a corner of the room sat a lovely girl, apparently in the depth of wretchedness. Her long raven curls hung in luxuriant profusion down her snowy neck. Her veil, thrown carelessly aside, exposed to view a high, clear, receding forehead, dark arched eyebrows, mild hazel eyes shaded by long, delicate lashes, a complexion of brilliant transparency, the whole face possessing that regularity of feature which constitutes beauty, but not that cast of countenance which subjects the person to the charge of insipidity. The natural expression of her face was of buoyant, gladsome mirth, but now the calm lustre of her dark eyes was quenched in anguish. She occasionally cast furtive glances at the captain, and then toward a small window which was firmly barricaded, but seeing no prospect of escape, she relapsed again into hopeless sorrow. Groups of blackguard soldiers were seated on stools in different parts of the room, many of them following the example of their officers, and others amusing themselves with burnishing their muskets and equipments. After numerous potations from his bottle, the captain started up, reeling under the influence of the liquor, and addressing a ruffian-looking officer, one of his boon companions. "Lieutenant Joceline, have the drum beat to arms, and take these lazy knaves, and scour the woods for a few miles around, and cut down or make prisoner every rebel rascal you meet. Leave soldiers enough, however, to guard the old castle. Quick, blast me, no hesitation." "Humph!" muttered the old soldier, ready enough to run his comrades into the noose, but devilish careful to keep his own delectable person out of danger. "Ha! What say you, you old grumbler? You shall stay here and guard the lady, if you are so much afraid of your beautiful self, and I will take command of the men." The lieutenant liked this proposition still worse than the former, but seeing no alternative, obeyed in silence. In a short time, the captain, accompanied by about 20 men, including a sergeant and 2 corporals, left their camp and proceeded toward the wood. It was nightfall when they reached the forest, through which the road was very narrow and circuitous. They were traveling along the path in double files, when the sergeant in front ordered a halt. "Why do we stop here," roared the captain, "when it is as dark as Egypt?" "I hear a noise like the trampling of horses," said the sergeant. "Hist, then," said Captain Lewis, "and draw up the men into a body, and await their arrival in silence." The horses' footsteps were now distinctly heard, but it was a solitary horseman whom these worthy soldiers were to encounter. When he arrived within speaking distance, the sergeant advanced a few paces in front of the soldiers, and exclaimed, "Stand, stand, or you are a dead man." The horseman evinced no disposition to comply with this arbitrary requisition, but deliberately drew a pistol from his holsters, and endeavored to urge his horse through the ranks of his opponents. Captain Lewis now came to the front of his men, and ordered, "Seize the bridle, and down with the rebel. Let no man lay a hand on me or on my horse, as he values his life," said the horseman in a determined tone, at the same time cocking his pistol. The sergeant drew back for a few yards, and discharged his carbine, but without effect. 2 soldiers grasped the horse by the head at the same instant. The horseman, seeing a struggle inevitable, literally blew out the brains of one of his assailants, and plucking his other pistol from its socket with his left hand, and fired at and slightly wounded his second antagonist. He now threw aside his pistols, etc., and then drew his heavy broadsword, and essayed to cut his way through his opponents. But giant strength, combined with the most desperate courage, could not successfully compete with such vast disparity of numbers. Some of his enemies fastened themselves on his horse, while others thrust at him with their bayonets, and after a protracted and furious contest, during which the Tories lost 5 men, the horseman was disarmed and brought to the ground. "Bind the rebel dog," shouted the infuriated captain. "He shall die the death of a felon, were he George Washington. By heaven," continued he, as he viewed the prostrate horseman, "it is Captain Edwards. Are then my dearest wishes gratified? I will be doubly revenged. Bind him hand and foot, boys, and throw him across his own horse, if the beast can bear him. If not, drive a bullet through the horse's brains, and carry the soldier in your arms." The Whig officer was firmly bound, and placed on his own charger, while a soldier marched on either side of him, and another led the horse. After prosecuting their route homeward near a mile, they were electrified with "No quarter to the cowardly Tories," cut them down root and branch, followed by the discharge of near a dozen pistols, which killed 4 men and wounded 2 or 3 others, and in a moment they were nearly surrounded by the dragoons under command of Lieutenant Brown. For a short time the contest was maintained with vigor. The bonds of Captain Edwards were soon cut, and he attacked the Tory captain, sword in hand, and after a short conflict succeeded in wounding him in the sword arm, and hurling him to the ground, and placing his foot on his breast, he said, "Now, you dastardly ruffian, avow your villainies, and inform me where I shall find Miss Howard, or by heaven's blue arch, I will send you where the tenor of your life will be hard to account for." The fierceness of the Whig soldier's manner, and the consciousness of being wholly in his power, completely humbled the Tory, and he begged his life, and promised to conduct the troops to his encampment, where they would find the lady in safety. The Tories were now effectually routed. Some were killed, some wounded, others captured, and some had escaped. A few miles' travel, and Captain Edwards and the men under his command arrived at the habitation of the Tories. A coarse, slovenly soldier was pacing the ground in front of the building, and on the advance of the Continental troops he presented his musket and ordered them to halt. Captain Edwards briefly informed him of the reverse that had taken place in the fortunes of his commander, and concluded by telling him that submission was safety, resistance death. The door was now burst open, and in a moment Miss Howard was folded in the arms of her lover. "Oh, George!" cried the weeping girl, as she endeavored to extricate herself from his embrace, "I had almost despaired of relief. I thought I was forsaken by all my friends, and you with the rest." "Forsake you? Never!" exclaimed he, fervently, as he again clasped her to his breast, "while life animates this body." "I believe you," said she. "I was a wretch to doubt your constancy and perseverance. But," she added, "we must not remain here an instant. My aunt will be in an agony till she hears of my deliverance." The scene that ensued on the arrival of the rescued fair one at the house of her aunt may be imagined, but cannot be accurately described. The old lady nearly stifled her niece with caresses, alternately thanking God and imploring blessings on the emancipator of the child of her hopes. Little more remains to be told. No entreaties of Captain Edwards, or persuasions of her aunt, could induce Miss Howard to give her hand to her admirer till the close of the war. On the establishment of peace, Colonel Edwards, for he had received that title, was made happy in the possession of the object of his long-tried affection. Lieutenant Brown served under his captain during the war, and on the promotion of Major Edwards succeeded to his command. The Tory Lewis and the remainder of his guilty accomplices were captured shortly after the occurrence of the above related transactions, and executed for desertion. End of Section 2. Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The White Witch of Soignies. All the roads leading to the famous city of Brussels were thronged with pensioners hastening to the Michaelmas Fair, which was held in the year 1567. Traders and farmers, with loaded vehicles of every description and size, were streaming onwards, and groups of gayer visitors on foot and on horseback, mingled with them, pursued the same route. The times were more tranquil than they had been for some time past. The recall of the Duke of Alba to Spain had revived the hopes of the wretched Flemings, who had for years endured his iron yoke, until their energies had been wholly subdued, and they had ceased to labor, because the fruits of their labor were seized by their rapacious taskmasters. Now, however, fairer prospects seemed to dawn upon them. The departure of the tyrant had driven away the despair which had almost overwhelmed them, and although a very few months had elapsed, the industry and commercial spirit of the people had begun to revive. The Michaelmas fair, which had been almost deserted, gave promise of exhibiting its former prosperity, and the great influx of merchants and visitors now upon the road seemed to fulfil that promise. Among the many persons journeying to Brussels, two in particular claim the attention of the readers of this history. They were well mounted and armed, but dressed in the coarse, ordinary garb of German horse dealers, and their occupation was farther indubitably manifested by each of them leading a horse by a halter. At the fair there could be no doubt that they would gain good prices for commodities so rare and so valuable. One of the riders was a stout, well-built man of about 40 years old. His features, handsome and prepossessing, had that frank and fearless air which experience and a knowledge of the world, gained by being an actor in its busiest scenes, usually confer. He looked too honest for a horse dealer, and but for his dress and the other indications which plainly pointed out his calling, a casual observer would have pronounced him to be of a superior class. The other traveller was much younger, and had not yet seen much more than 25 summers. He was tall, well knit, and graceful in his demeanour. Coarse was his garb, yet there was in its arrangement an obvious attempt to triumph over the disadvantages which belonged to it, and by the manner in which his cap was cocked, you might swear the young fellow thought he was worth looking at. At the fair to which he was hastening, there could be no doubt that he would be as much admired by the Flemish lasses as his horse would be by the connoisseurs of the other sex. The steeds which they rode and led were such animals as for blood and figure were not often to be met with, of the true Spanish breed, and full of that Arabian fire which at the period here spoken of had so great an influence upon the men as well as the horses of Spain. They were such as would have made fit presents for a king. The rarity and value of their cattle might have accounted for the superior appearance of our dealers, but a conversation which took place between them will explain it in a more satisfactory manner. Yonder, said the elder traveller, are the towers of Brussels, and there, for the present, our journeying must end. Now, for the last time, good comrade, let me remind thee that thou art a horse dealer and a German. Let no word of Spanish, and as little Flemish as may be, pass thy lips. Forget all notions of gentility and chivalry. Sit loosely on thy horse, and as like a serving man as may be. Leave that military straightness of port, and forget that thou hast ever ridden at the head of thy troop. Thank heaven that we are about to reach Brussels, said the younger, for then at least, most reverend Gaspar, I shall be relieved from thy counsels. By night and by day, sleeping and waking, full and fasting, drunk and sober, hast thou dinned into my ears the sage precepts which thou thinkest necessary to guide my conduct, until I know each of them as well, or better, God forgive me, than my prayers. And upon a most ungrateful pair of ears have I bestowed all my good advice, since this is the return I get for it, replied Gaspar. Thou dost injustice to thyself, most sage counsellor, if thou deemest that I regard not thy precepts, and thou dost me no less wrong if thou deemest that I do not intend to obey them. Marry, Albrecht, thou hadst better, unless thou hast a mind to feel a hempen collar about thy neck, for that will inevitably be the fate of both of us if we should be discovered. And as I have no taste for hanging, Gaspar, thou mayest believe that I mean not willingly to put myself in danger of it. Believe me, old friend, that I do not undervalue thy counsel, but by being so often repeated, it falls a little dully upon mine ear. There was no exaggeration in honest Gaspar's speech. If their errand had been discovered, their death was certain. The noblemen and gentlemen of the Low Countries had resolved to make an attempt to throw off the domination of the Spaniards. This had been determined in a numerous assembly, where they had sworn to support the cause of their country's freedom, though it should reduce them to the most abject poverty. For confiscation of all their property was what they must have expected at least, if their design should be discovered. In the fervour of the moment, one of the chiefs proposed that they should pledge a toast, expressing their devotion to the cause, jusqu'à la besace, in allusion to the ruin they were likely to encounter in accomplishing their object. They thence adopted the name of beggars. Their device was a scrip or dole wallet, and many of their party signals consisted of allusions to the habits and practices of beggars. Albrecht von Engelbart was the son of a nobleman who had lost his life and fortune in the earlier part of the struggle which ended in the total subjection of his country. Albrecht, who at his father's death was a mere infant, had been sent into Spain, where he had been educated, and by the aid of some of his father's friends had been admitted into the Spanish army. He had shown himself the worthy child of a race who had long been distinguished for gallantry and prowess. On his return to the Low Countries, he had been initiated into the fraternity of the beggars, and had sworn to devote all his power to revenging his father's death and freeing his country. The times were favorable for a revolt. All preparations had been made for its taking place at Brussels at the Michaelmas Fair. Albrecht and Gaspar, his old military instructor and a firm friend of his father, had agreed to be there to aid the revolt. They had chosen the dress of horse dealers, not only as a disguise, but because it enabled them to introduce into the city, without suspicion, 2 excellent chargers belonging to the Count Berg, who was in person to head the revolt, and who was like themselves to come into the city in disguise. By the time that this discourse had reached the point at which we left it, our travellers were near the gate by which they were to enter the city of Brussels. As their appearance was not calculated to excite any suspicion, they passed the guard unquestioned, and rode to a hotel in the great market-place, where, having bestowed their steeds safely, they repaired to the common room of the inn for the purpose of supping. This place was so crowded that it was with difficulty they found a seat, and when they did so, they were compelled to take up with a place at a table where sat a company who appeared to be little better than mendicants. If it be true that misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows, it is no less true that hunger makes folks but little fastidious in their choice of companions. Our travellers sat down to their repast, and were so much occupied with it that they paid little attention to the conversation which was passing around them, or to the persons by whom it was carried on. Their appetites being satisfied, they had leisure to listen, and the younger traveller became very much interested in a discussion which was carried on with some warmth respecting a popular tradition that prevailed in the neighbourhood of Brussels, and to consider the appearance of the persons among whom chance had thrown him. An old man of venerable appearance, accompanied by a young girl, whose complexion announced her to belong to one of those vagrant tribes which, under the name of Bohemians or Gypsies, were then and are still scattered over Europe, were sitting at the end of the table. The patched doublet and capacious grip of the old man showed him plainly to be a common beggar. The young woman was little better, but all the disadvantages of a very coarse attire were not able to conceal her rare beauty, to which her brilliant and expressive eyes added a power which was almost irresistible. The only other person engaged in the discourse was a tall man of sinister aspect, who wore a patch over one of his eyes, and whose countenance had a mingled expression of cunning and audacity, which rendered him as disagreeable looking a ruffian as can be imagined. They were talking over the story of the White Witch of Soignies, which the old man insisted was as true as that of the Duke of Alba was the governor of Spain, and the other man ridiculed it as an old woman's fable. Albrecht's curiosity was excited, and he begged to know what the story was about. "Whence came you, my son," said the old man, turning to him, "that you do not know the legend of the White Witch of Soignies?" And then, without waiting to be answered, he went on, "In times, and many years before this country owned its present masters, the broad barony of Soignies, extending over many a league, and taking both tower and town within its verge, was the property of the lords of Engelbart." Albrecht's curiosity was now more strongly excited than ever. He knew nothing of the history of his family but the fate of his father, and he listened eagerly to the old man's story. Rodolphe von Engelbart was the flower of the chivalry of his day, and happier than all his peers in the possession of the most beautiful and virtuous lady in the land as his wife. One thing alone troubled their felicity. The baron, who was an excellent man in other respects, had, either by constitution or from a want of control, a habit of indulging in very violent transports of passion. When these excesses were upon him, he gave vent to the most unseemly and irreverent language, which shocked and distressed his amiable wife beyond measure. She frequently remonstrated with him, and when the fit was over, he would express the greatest contrition for his fault, and make the most fervent vows that he would never so offend again. But when anything happened to awaken the tempest of his ire, he was as fierce and ungovernable in his language as ever. His wife was seized with a sudden distemper, which proved rapidly fatal, and in a few days he was left alone in a world which had lost to him its only charm. He threw himself beside the cold corpse of his wife, and wept with an agony that seemed too violent for existence. At length he was forced violently from the chamber of death. The preparations were made for the funeral, and the Baroness was interred with the solemnities that befitted her high rank. With that prostration of soul which often accompanies deep grief, the Baron repaired to the chapel of his castle on the evening after the funeral, and kneeling before the high altar, he humbly and ardently besought forgiveness from heaven, and in the desperation of the moment prayed either for death upon himself or that his wife might be restored to him. A low sound of music appeared to pass near him. He rose and approached the small postern of the chapel which led to the garden, and by which he had entered. Immediately opposite was the chamber which his wife had been used to sit. The long window which opened on the lawn was widely unclosed. The music again stole over his senses. It was the lute of his wife. It was the very air she had played to him so often. He thought he dreamed. He rushed toward the chamber, and to his unspeakable astonishment beheld her sitting there in her familiar position, and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. In a moment he clasped her in his arms, and found her warm and breathing. As soon as he could command himself so as to utter any coherent expressions, he begged her to explain to him by what means she had been so suddenly restored to existence. She looked at him gravely, and begged him to ask her no such questions. Heaven has restored me to you for the purpose of correcting that sin in which you have hitherto indulged. If you love me, you will never again give way to passion or to intemperate language. I am yours upon this condition alone, and the moment that you so offend will be the last of my existence. It were long to tell all the vows and oaths the Baron made to his new-found wife in the transports of his gratitude. The event wrought a visible change in him. The impression which it had made upon his mind was so deep and lasting that he from that moment kept a powerful control over himself, and was never heard to utter an intemperate word. For years their happiness remained undisturbed. Several children blessed their reunion. One day the Baron's favourite stag-hound returned home grievously wounded. Some unlucky hunter had stricken the dog with a quarrel. The Baron was so vexed that he forgot his oaths, and vented a torrent of imprecations against the hand by which his dog had been crippled. A low moan from his wife arrested his attention. She was gazing at him with an expression of grief which suddenly calmed his rage. He approached, and to his surprise and horror, her form seemed to melt in his embrace, and she vanished into air. The children she had borne since her reappearance disappeared at the same moment, and the Baron saw then that it was the phantom of his wife, and not herself, that he had been living with. He survived this event but a short time, and ever since that period the wood of Soignies has been haunted at particular times by a female figure which appears dressed in white, bearing a wand in her hand. She seldom appears but when some important event is going to befall some of the descendants of the house of Engelbart. It is said she will reply to any of that blood when accosted by them, that she will disclose to them the secrets of their destiny, but that to all others she is silent. The people of the neighbourhood, many of whom have seen her, call her the White Witch of Soignies. The old man's tale being finished, Albrecht asked him eagerly where the phantom was to be seen. In the wood of Soignies, at that part which reaches to the lake of Labree. At least that is the spot in which she has been the oftenest seen. Albrecht remained for some time in deep thought. He felt a great desire to visit the place which had been spoken of, and to see if he might the phantom shape that could inform him of his future destiny. He was roused from his reverie by the approach of the man who had been in conversation with the old beggar. "May I ask, comrade," said he, with an air of familiarity, "what brings you hither?" Albrecht was about to tell him that he thought him an impudent rogue, when Gaspar, who saw the storm rising, prevented it by replying that they were horse dealers, and came in hope of finding a purchaser for 2 thoroughbred horses. "You come to a bad market," said the fellow, "for all the nobles in this country are beggars." Our travellers both looked at him earnestly. Any allusion to beggars was well known among them to be a sign of fellowship, and they were convinced that they had guessed rightly in supposing him to be one of their party. When he made a secret signal by which they announced themselves to each other, they immediately entered into a low conversation, in the course of which the stranger informed them that he was a retainer of the Count Berg's, that his master would not be in the city until the next day but one, that the rising would not take place until then, and that in the meantime they must be cautious and by no means leave the city. Albrecht, who had felt a prepossession in favour of the old mendicant, whose venerable appearance and imposing manner seemed to imply that he had not always been so low in fortune as he now seemed to be, asked the stranger if he was of their fraternity. He replied he thought not, but immediately tried the old man with the signal. He made no reply, and they were therefore convinced that he was a real beggar and not one for merely political purposes. The old man rose to depart, and the beautiful girl who had been sitting beside him gave him her arm. Albrecht, seeing he walked with difficulty, offered his assistance. The old man thanked him, and as he drew near the door, grasping the youth's arm with a force and energy which by no means corresponded with his tottering gait, he whispered in his ear, "Son of Engelbart, if you would see the white woman of Soignies, repair tomorrow betimes to the lake of Labree. Cross the lake, and to you she will be visible. But say not a word of your intentions to any but Gaspar, and beware of your new acquaintance. There is danger in him. We shall meet again. Now begone." They were by this time at the door of the room, and the old man, shaking off Albrecht at the same time that he warmly pressed his hand, disappeared with the young gipsy. Albrecht returned to Gaspar, whom he found in discourse with the stranger. He thought he had never seen a more vicious expression than this fellow's features presented, and he was convinced the old man's caution was a useful one. Under the pretence of fatigue, he persuaded Gaspar to retire, and as soon as they were alone, he told him of the determination he had formed to visit the lake of Labree. Gaspar tried to dissuade him, but finding that it was in vain, he resolved to accompany him. He was satisfied that the rising was not to take place till the day following the next, and as he was afraid that Albrecht's impetuosity might break out, he was not perhaps sorry to get him out of the crowded city. As soon as the sun was up on the following morning, Albrecht roused his companion, and saddling their horses, they set off toward the wood of Soignies. Half an hour's riding brought them to the spot which had been indicated to them by the old man. The lake here formed a small bay, at the end of which stood a cottage inhabited by an old man who derived his subsistence by fishing in the lake. They easily induced him to take charge of their horses, and to lend them his boat for the purpose of making an excursion on the lake and of viewing the scenery on the opposite shore. They entered the boat, and having pulled into the middle of the lake, they saw very plainly at the most remote point of the opposite shore a small white cross which surmounted the chapel or hermitage of which they had heard. With an energy which this strong curiosity had excited, Albrecht directed the boat to that point, and Gaspar, with less curiosity but not with less goodwill, seconded his exertions. They soon made the chapel, and running the boat into a small creek which was beside it, Albrecht looked about him with the kind of incredulous but uncertain feeling which scorns to believe what the heart devoutly wishes may be true. He stood up in the boat, listening and looking intently around. Not a sound fell upon his ear but the murmur of the ripples which the soft wind roused upon the bosom of the placid lake as they gently touched the pebbly shore. No sight met his anxious eye but a flitting bird which occasionally darted out from the thick wood and flew rapidly from one tall tree to another. He began to think that he should have nothing but his labour for his pains, and the sarcasms of Gaspar on the road to Brussels, when he fancied he heard a sound like that of low music. He listened almost breathless. He could not be mistaken. It increased, and now he heard distinctly a melody as wild and as beautiful as that which the night wind makes when it dies upon the chords of a neglected harp. Even Gaspar heard it, for without rising from his seat in the boat, he inclined his head toward the water to catch it. It became louder and approached nearer. Albrecht was about to speak when at a short distance through the trees he saw a light vapory form which by degrees became more distinct. It assumed a positive shape, and he saw visibly and plainly before him exactly such a figure as had been described to him, a female form of delicate and beautiful proportions, clad in white, with dark hair hanging down her shoulders, and having a wreath of flowers on her head, stood looking toward him. She glided on as if she trod not upon the earth, and beckoned him with a wand which she held as if inviting him to follow her. Without uttering a word, and before Gaspar was aware of his intention, he leaped ashore, and darting through the thicket pursued the form which fled rapidly from him. Gaspar did not venture to leave the boat until he had devised some means of fastening it to the shore, and by the time he had accomplished this, Albrecht was out of sight. To follow him was in vain, for his companion had not been able to tell exactly at what point he had disappeared. There was no path through the thicket. He called as loud as he could until the wood re-echoed with Albrecht's name, but it was from the echo alone he obtained a reply. In utter despair, after climbing the tallest trees he could see, he sat down by the shore to vent his anger by blaming his companion and himself in the most eloquent vein that his vexation could suggest. For the first half-hour this was well enough, but after that he got tired, and more than ever anxious. The time at which they ought to be at Brussels was drawing nigh. His honour and Albrecht's were pledged to their being in the city. To fail in performing this engagement was a thought he could not brook. To go alone and leave his friend to dangers, which seemed the greater because he could not define them, was as disagreeable an alternative. He determined at length to make one more effort to seek him, and if that should fail, to hasten across the lake and thence to Brussels, where he would supply Albrecht's absence as well as he might. At the same time, in order to secure his friend's retreat, he had resolved to dispatch the waterman back with the boat to await the youth's return. Full of this determination, he penetrated the thicket by which, as nearly as he could recollect, Albrecht might have gone. But although he struggled manfully, and received with indifference many a blow on the face and shoulders from the thick underwood which abounded, his labour was in vain. He could find neither track nor path, and after a fruitless struggle he returned to the shore to put the other part of his resolution into effect. His boat was moored fast where he had left it, but to his consternation he found that the oars and sail had been taken away during his short absence. He looked about, but the more he looked, the more he thought, the more he was lost in amazement. The means of proceeding were taken wholly away from him, and he could not imagine how. To go by land was impossible. He did not know the road. If he had, it was so far about that he could not hope to reach Brussels by the morning. He was getting monstrously hungry, without the most remote chance of satisfying his appetite, and in short he began to feel himself in the situation of a man who is perfectly miserable, without the possibility of helping himself. This conviction, when after much swearing and stamping and passion he did arrive at it, brought him some consolation. He saw it was in vain to struggle, and he therefore made up his mind to endure, as well as he might, the evils he could not remove. He stepped on shore again, and entered the small chapel which was close at hand. Here, to his comfort no less than to his astonishment, he found on the table some cold meat and a flask of wine, which, whether he had met with it in a hermitage or elsewhere, he could not deny to be excellent. We must, however, leave him to follow Albrecht in his pursuit of the white phantom. With expectations raised to the utmost pitch, he made his way through the tangled recesses of the wood, ever keeping in view, but never being able to reach the extraordinary being who by her looks and gestures clearly invited him to follow her. He had done so in breathless anxiety for some minutes, when a turning in the path brought him in the front of a large mass of rocks, in the centre of which was a rude opening, which served for a doorway. Here the witch entered, and stood for a moment, beckoning him. Within all seemed dark, but a faint light at a considerable distance, which glimmered like an evening star. He saw the white figure gliding before him, and heard the rustling of female drapery after he had ceased clearly to distinguish her form. Still he passed on, resolved to discover, if it were possible, the meaning of this mysterious visitant. The light became more visible as he approached it, and he saw at length that it proceeded from a fir tree torch stuck against the wall. The figure was before him, within a few paces of him. He sprang forward, and at the very moment that he thought the floating robe was within his grasp, the witch disappeared from his sight, as if she had entered the solid rock which barred his further passage. He looked around him in amazement. He was in a sort of chamber formed in the rock, but he could discover no outlet save the passage by which he had entered. While he was pondering on this singular event, the same wild strain which he had before heard struck upon his ear, and a voice which seemed to be close to him gently said, "Son of Engelbart, your destinies are about to be opened to you. The descendant of a glorious line is called to deeds worthy of the race he is descended from." At the same moment the fir torch was dashed to the ground, and all was left in utter darkness. But before Albrecht had time to recover from his surprise, a noise was heard like the turning of a heavy wheel, and looking toward the spot whence the sound proceeded, he saw a stream of light, which in the next moment he discovered to proceed from an opening in the rock, which gradually enlarged until it was wide enough to admit the passage of a man's body. "Enter without doubt or fear," cried a sonorous and manly voice. Albrecht obeyed, and the moment he had cleared the passage, the fragments of rock fell back in its place, with a noise which echoed through the vaults like thunder. Albrecht saw himself in a large vaulted chamber, lighted by a multitude of fine torches, like that he had seen in the passage. A table was in the centre, round which sat about 40 men, well armed and having a martial appearance. Round the room hung a quantity of tattered and patched garments, with scrips and beggars' staves. At the head of the table sat a man above the middle stature, of a stalwart look, and although he was perhaps 50 years old, he was still active as a much younger man. His piercing eye fixed on Albrecht as he called out to the heir of Engelbart to approach. "You are among your country's and your father's friends," he added, "and although we might at other times have to offer you some excuse for the devices which have been practised to lead you hither, this is no time for ceremony. Without further preface, then, let me inform you that you are in the presence of that company of the beggars, of which you are a member, although until this moment you have not been initiated into all their secrets. I am the Count Brederode, and I have been thought worthy to fill the seat in which you see me. The enterprise in which you are engaged at Brussels has failed. The villain whom you talked with at the inn last night was a spy of the Duke of Alba's, and his object was to detain you and others there, that he might ensure your destruction. My plan was to get you out of the city. Persuasions, I thought, would not succeed so well as the scheme I have had recourse to, and when you know that I am the same decrepit-seeming old man who related to you the fabulous legend of the White Lady of Soignies, you will know all the secret. I need not tell you now that you have been so far deluded, but it is fit you should know that my means of the White Witch, and the fears she has spread among the people of this neighbourhood, we have been enabled to secure this retreat, when we have been hunted from our own halls by the tyrant whose iron rod rules our country. But better times are at hand. The gallant William, Prince of Orange, has organized a force which will soon be in action. The brave men you see about you are to join him as soon as the plans are finally arranged, and among them is to be your place, with such rank as befits your father's son. When the Count had finished, he rose, and embracing Albrecht, introduced him by name to each of the other warriors. Albrecht became anxious about Gaspard, and told Brederode that he was desirous his friend's safety should be looked to. That has been provided for, said the Count. He is nearer than he or you imagine. The hermitage communicates with this chamber, and the danger at Brussels being over, he may now enter. He made a signal to one of the younger warriors, who disappeared, and in about 2 minutes returned with Gaspard blindfolded. On the handkerchief being taken from his eyes, his surprise may be imagined. Short explanation sufficed for him, and when he heard that a general massacre of all who were suspected of being disaffected was to have taken place at Brussels, he was extremely grateful to the Confederates and to the White Witch for having rescued him. One part of the tale, not the least interesting, remains to be told, but our limits warn us it must be told concisely. The White Witch was, as some of our readers have guessed, the identical gypsy, the old beggar's attendant, and both characters were equally foreign from her own. She was the courageous and enterprising daughter of Brederode, one of the most gallant and single-minded men that ever drew his sword for the holy cause of freedom. The affection of his daughter Marguerite for him induced her to share his perils. Her presence of mind and intrepidity had rescued him from many of them. Albrecht remained in the cavern long enough to know her rare virtues, and to be captivated by her singular beauty. The fair days were at hand. The insurrection by the Prince of Orange was eminently successful, and the feats of the Baron von Engelbart contributed in no small degree to that success. Peace again visited a land from which she had been long an exile. Engelbart was restored to his barony and his demesnes. Need we say to the intelligent reader with whom he shared them? For many years in happiness and content did Albrecht and Marguerite live in the halls of his ancestors, and his bride bore to the day of her death the appropriate cognomen of the White Witch of Soignies. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, Jacqueline. Death lies on her like an untimely frost upon the sweetest flower of all the field. Shakespeare. Dear mother, is it not the bell I hear? Yes, my child, the bell for morning prayers. It is Sunday today. I had forgotten it, but now all days are alike to me. Hark, it sounds again, louder, louder. Open the window, for I love the sound. There, the sunshine and the fresh morning air revive me. And the church bell, oh, mother, it reminds me of the holy Sabbath mornings by the Loire, so calm, so hushed, so beautiful. Now give me my prayer book and draw the curtain back, that I may see the green trees and the church spire. I feel better today, dear mother. It was a bright, cloudless morning in August. The dew still glistened on the trees, and a slight breeze wafted to the sick chamber of Jacqueline the song of the birds, the rustle of the leaves, and the solemn chime of the church bells. She had been raised up in bed, and reclining upon the pillow was gazing wistfully upon the quiet scene without. Her mother gave her the prayer-book, and then turned away to hide a tear that stole down her cheek. At length the bells ceased. Jacqueline crossed herself, kissed a pearl crucifix that hung around her neck, and opened the silver clasps of her missal. For a time she seemed wholly absorbed in her devotions. Her lips moved, but no sound was audible. At intervals the solemn voice of the priest was heard at a distance, and then the confused responses of the congregation, dying away in inarticulate murmurs. Ere long the thrilling chant of the Catholic service broke upon the ear. At first it was low, solemn, and indistinct. Then it became more earnest and entreating, and as if interceding and imploring pardon for sin, and then arose louder and louder, full, harmonious, majestic, as it wafted the song of praise to heaven, and suddenly ceased. Then the sweet tones of the organ were heard, trembling, thrilling, and rising higher and higher, and filling the whole air with their rich, melodious music. What exquisite accords! What noble harmonies! What touching pathos! The soul of the sick girl seemed to kindle into more ardent devotion, and to be rapt away to heaven in the full harmonious chorus, as it swelled onward, doubling and redoubling, and rolling upward in a full burst of rapturous devotion. Then all was hushed again. Once more the low sound of the bell smote the air, and announced the elevation of the host. The invalid seemed entranced in prayer. Her book had fallen beside her. Her hands were clasped, her eyes closed, her soul retired within its secret chambers. Then a more triumphant peal of bells arose. The tears gushed from her closed and swollen lids. Her cheek was flushed. She opened her dark eyes and fixed them with an expression of deep adoration and penitence upon an image of the Saviour on the cross, which hung at the foot of the bed, and her lips again moved in prayer. Her countenance expressed the deepest resignation. She seemed to ask only that she might die in peace and go to the bosom of her Redeemer. The mother was kneeling by the window with her face concealed in the folds of the curtain. She arose, and going to the bedside of her child, threw her arms around her and burst into tears. "My dear mother, I shall not live long. I feel it here, this piercing pain. At times it seizes me, and I cannot breathe. My child, you will be better soon. Yes, mother, I shall be better soon. All tears and pain and sorrow will be over. The hymn of adoration and entreaty I have just heard I shall never hear again on earth. Next Sabbath, mother, kneel again by that window as today. I shall not be here upon this bed of pain and sickness, but when you hear the solemn hymn of worship and the beseeching tones that wing the spirit up to God, think, mother, that I am there with my sweet sister who has gone before us, kneeling at our Saviour's feet, and happy, oh, how happy." The afflicted mother made no reply. Her heart was too full to speak. "You remember, mother, how calmly Amy died? Poor child, she was so young and beautiful. I always pray that I may die as she did. I do not fear death as I did before she was taken from us. But oh, this pain, this cruel pain, it seems to draw my mind back from heaven. When it leaves me, I shall die in peace. My poor child, God's holy will be done." The invalid soon sank into a quiet slumber. The excitement was over, and exhausted nature sought relief in sleep. The persons between whom this scene passed were a widow and her sick daughter from the neighbourhood of Tours. They had left the banks of the Loire to consult the more experienced physicians of the metropolis, and had been directed to the Maison de Santé at Auteuil for the benefit of the pure air. But all in vain. The health of the suffering but uncomplaining patient grew worse and worse, and it soon became evident that the closing scene was drawing near. Of this Jacqueline herself seemed conscious, and toward evening she expressed a wish to receive the last sacraments of the church. A priest was sent for, and ere long the tinkling of a little bell in the street announced his approach. He bore in his hand a silver vase containing the consecrated wafer, and a small vessel filled with the holy oil of the extreme unction hung from his neck. Before him walked a boy carrying a little bell, whose sound announced the passing of these symbols of the Catholic faith. In the rear, a few of the villagers bearing lighted wax tapers formed a short and melancholy procession. They soon entered The sick chamber and the glimmer of the tapers mingled with the red light of the setting sun that shot his farewell rays through the open window. The vessel of oil and the vase containing the consecrated wafer were placed upon the table in front of a crucifix that hung upon the wall, and all present, excepting the priest, threw themselves upon their knees. The priest then approached the bed of the dying girl and said in a slow and solemn tone, "The King of Kings and Lord of Lords has passed thy threshold. Is thy spirit ready to receive him?" "It is, Father." "Hast thou confessed thy sins, Holy Father?" "No." "Confess thyself, then, that thy sins may be forgiven, and thy name recorded in the book of life." And turning to the kneeling crowd around, he waved his hand for them to retire, and was left alone with the sick girl. He seated himself beside her pillow, and the subdued whisper of the confession mingled with the murmur of the evening air, which lifted the heavy folds of the curtains and stole in upon the holy scene. Poor Jacqueline had few sins to confess, a secret thought or two toward the pleasures and delights of the world, a wish to live unuttered, but which, to the eye of her self-accusing spirit, seemed to resist the wise providence of God. No more. The confession of a meek and lowly heart is soon made. The door was again opened, the attendants entered, and knelt around the bed, and the priest proceeded, "And now prepare thyself to receive with contrite heart the body of our blessed Lord and Redeemer. Dost thou believe that our Lord Jesus Christ was conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary?" "I believe," and all present joined in the solemn response, "I believe." "Dost thou believe that the Father is God, that the Son is God, and that the Holy Spirit is God, three persons and one God?" "I believe." "Dost thou believe that the Son is seated on the right hand of the Majesty on high, whence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead?" "I believe." "Dost thou believe that by the holy sacraments of the Church thy sins are forgiven thee, and that thus thou art made worthy of eternal life?" "I believe." "Dost thou pardon with all thy heart all who have offended thee in thought, word, or deed?" "I pardon them." "And dost thou ask pardon of God and thy neighbor for all offences thou hast committed against them, either in thought, word, or deed?" "I do." "Then repeat after me, O Lord Jesus, I am not worthy, nor do I merit, that thy divine majesty should enter this poor tenement of clay. But according to thy holy promises be my sins forgiven, and my soul washed white from all transgression." Then taking a consecrated wafer from the vase, he placed it between the lips of the dying girl, and while the assistant sounded the little silver bell, said, "Corpus Domini Nostri Jesu Christi custodiat animam tuam in vitam aeternam." And the kneeling crowd smote their breasts and responded in one solemn voice, "Amen." The priest then took from the silver box on the table a little golden rod, and dipping it in holy oil, anointed the invalid upon the hands, feet, and breast in the form of the cross. When these ceremonies were completed, the priest and his attendants retired, leaving the mother alone with her dying child, who from the exhaustion caused by the preceding scene sank into a death-like sleep. Between two worlds life hovered like a star, twixt night and morn upon the horizon's verge. The long twilight of the summer evening stole on, the shadows deepened without, and the night lamp glimmered freely in the sick chamber, but still she slept. She was lying with her hands clasped upon her breast, her pallid cheek resting upon the pillow, and her bloodless lips apart, but motionless and silent as the sleep of death. Not a breath interrupted the silence of her slumbers, not a movement of the heavy and sunken eyelid, not a trembling of the lip, not a shadow on the marble brow told when the spirit took its flight. It passed to a better world than this. There's a perpetual spring, perpetual youth. No joint benumbing cold, nor scorching heat, famine, nor age have any being there. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Hussar's Saddle. Can the bracelet of union be composed of unequal gems? Tales of a Parrot. Old Ludovic Hartz always regarded his saddle with the deepest veneration, and yet there appeared nothing about it capable of exciting his idolatry. It was a Turkish saddle, old and deeply stained with blood, yet to the brave Ludovic it recalled a tale of other days, when he, young, ardent, enthusiastic, in defence of his country, first drew his sword against its enemies. He had been opposed in battle to the hostile invaders of his native Hungary, and many a misbelieving dog had his good Seba smitten to the earth. Various had been the fortune of the war, and too frequently was the glory of the Holy Cross dimmed by the lustre of the triumphant crescent. Such sad disasters were seldom alluded to by the brave hussar, but he loved to dwell on the successful actions in which he had been engaged. It was in one of these fierce combats that, cut off suddenly from his party, he found himself surrounded by 4 infuriated Turks. But the recollection of you and your angel mother, would Ludovic say to his daughter, nerved my arm. I was assailed by all my opponents. How 3 fell I knew not, but severe and long was the conflict with the last of my foes, whose powerful arm was raised against me. Already I saw my wife a mournful widow, and my child fatherless, and these dreadful thoughts infusing fresh vigour into my arm, I smote the infidel dog to death, hurled him from his steed, and rifled him as he lay. At this moment several of the enemy appeared in sight, but I was too much exhausted to renew the perilous conflict. My gallant horse lay wounded, and in the agonies of death. I threw myself on the Turkish courser, and forced him on at his utmost speed, until I regained my squadron. The saddle was steeped in the blood of my foe, and mine mingled with it. When the cessation of hostilities permitted the troops to rest for a space from the horrors of war, I hastened with the treasure which, during my campaign, I had acquired, to my home, purchased these fertile fields around my dwelling, and forgot for a season the miseries of war. The good Ludovic would here pause. He still retained a lively recollection of his lost wife, and he could not bear to narrate the circumstances of her illness and death. After that sad event, his home became hateful to him, and he resolved again to engage in the arduous duties of a soldier. The little Theresa was kindly adopted into the family of his only brother, and there, after a lapse of some years, our good hussar found her blooming in youthful beauty. Ludovic arrived only in time to close his brother's eyes, who, on his death-bed, entreated him to bestow Theresa on his only son, when they should have attained the proper age. Grateful for his almost parental care of his child, and moved by the situation of his brother, whose heart seemed to be bent on this union, Ludovic promised that, when his daughter should have attained the age of 18, she should become the wife of Karl, provided Karl himself desired the connection at that time, and satisfied with this promise, the old man died in peace. This engagement was concealed from Theresa, but it was known to Karl, who exulted in the thought that this rich prize would one day be his. With low habits and a coarse turn of mind, the delicate graces of Theresa had no charms for him. He loved her not, but he loved the wealth, which would one day be hers, and which he looked on with a greedy eye. The 1,000 soft and nameless feelings which accompany a generous and tender passion were unknown to Karl. It was a hard task to him to attend his gentle mistress, nor did he ever appear disposed to play the part of a lover, except when some other seemed inclined to supply his place. It was at a rural fete, given by Ludovic to his neighbours, at the termination of an abundant harvest, that Karl first chose openly to assert his right. He had taken it for granted that he should open the dance with Theresa. What then was his indignation, when on entering the apartment where the guests were assembled, he saw Theresa, her slender waist encircled by the arm of a young hussar, and moving in the graceful waltz. The evident superiority of his rival, whose well-knit limbs, firm step, free and martial air, formed a striking contrast to his own clownish figure and awkward gait, only increased his ire, and in violent wrath he advanced to Theresa, insisting on his right to open the dance with her. Theresa pleaded her engagement. He persisted. She refused his request, and laughed at his anger. He became violent and rude. The hussar interfered, and the quarrel rose so high as to draw Ludovic to the spot. Karl, in a voice almost choked with passion, laid his grievances before him. Theresa, in a tone of indignation, complained to her father of his insolence, and appealed to him whether she were not at liberty to select any partner for the dance she thought proper. "You have no such liberty," thundered forth Karl. "You are my betrothed wife, and as such belong to me alone." Theresa cast on him a smile full of scorn and contempt, but it faded as she looked to her father, and a deadly paleness overspread her countenance as she inquired, "Father, does this man speak the truth?" "He does, my child," was the reply, and she dropped insensible at his feet. The young hussar now knelt down beside her, passionately kissing her fair forehead, and raising her in his arms, bore her to the adjoining apartment, followed by the father and Karl. Theresa slowly revived. At first she saw no one, and breathing a deep sigh, she murmured, "It was all a horrid dream." An anguished groan startled her into perception and agony. She looked up and saw her father standing before her with folded arms, and a countenance clouded with grief. Karl also stood near, with an exulting smile, and the hussar knelt beside her, but his face was buried in his hands. She then found it was no dream. She looked to her father. "Father, is there no hope?" "None. My honor is pledged." She turned to the hussar, and placed for a moment her cold hands in his. Then rising suddenly, she threw herself at the feet of Karl. "Oh, Karl, have mercy! I love another. You do not love me. Have pity on us."
"By all the powers of heaven and hell, you shall be mine, Theresa."
"I appeal to my father."
"Will your father violate his promise to the dead?"
"I will not," said Ludovic with solemnity.
"Then, Theresa," exclaimed Karl with fiend-like exultation, "no power on earth shall save you from being mine." And saying thus, he left the house.
Theresa rose from her knees and threw herself into the arms of her lover. The presence of her father was no restraint on her pure tenderness. Her tears fell fast on his manly countenance, but his agony was too great for that relief. Ludovic was deeply moved. He approached them and endeavoured to calm their affliction, and he related under what circumstances his promise had been given, but his concluding words, that he must hold it sacred, threw them into a new paroxysm of grief. "We must part, then, Arnold," said the weeping Theresa. "We must part. Ah, can we survive this cruel blow?" "No," said Arnold. "No, I cannot live without you. Let us once more entreat your father to have pity on us." And the youthful lovers threw themselves at his feet.
"Arnold," said Ludovic sternly, "thou art a soldier, and ask me to tarnish my honor?"
Arnold felt the appeal. He started up, raised the weeping Theresa, cut off with his sabre one long bright tress, embraced and kissed her, placed her in the arms of her father, and fled. Every passing day carried with it some portion of the fortitude of Theresa, and she saw the near approach of the period which was to consign her to a fate so dreadful. 3 little weeks were all that lay between her and misery. Ludovic endeavoured to soothe her, but she would not be comforted. Even had her affections been disengaged, Karl would have been distasteful to her, but with affections placed on another, the idea of a union with him appeared insupportable. "My dear child," would Ludovic say, interrupting a passionate burst of grief, "by what magic has Arnold gained your heart?" "He is a hussar," replied Theresa. There was something in this reply which moved Ludovic. He recollected that he himself had imbued the mind of his daughter with sentiments of respect and esteem for the character of a good soldier, and conscience reminded him that he had too often exalted the profession of arms over the peaceful and unobtrusive occupations of the husbandman. Was it wonderful, then, that Theresa should have imbibed something of this spirit, or that she should have yielded her heart to one who possessed courage to defend her, and tenderness to soothe her under the afflictions of life? Arnold dwelt near them. He had been the early playmate of Theresa, and together they had often, with glowing cheeks and sparkling eyes, listened to the warlike exploits which the good Ludovic delighted to narrate to them. And to these conversations may be attributable the passionate desire of Arnold to adopt the profession of arms. Accustomed to see them play together as children, and liking the society of the generous and spirited boy, Ludovic forgot the danger, when their childhood passed away, of their affection assuming a totally different character. It was so, and Ludovic now saw, with deep grief, that his daughter was unalterably attached to the youthful soldier. If Theresa was unhappy, her father was scarcely less so. He blamed his own imprudence, and on contrasting the characters of the 2 youths, a violent conflict between his feelings and his duty arose in his breast. But the stern honor of the soldier triumphed, and he deemed himself bound to complete the sacrifice. Unable, however, to endure the sight of her grief, he carried her to the abode of a youthful female friend, who formerly resided near them, but on her marriage had removed to a village distant about 60 miles from the dwelling of Ludovic. There he left Teresa after receiving her solemn promise that she would return with him the day before that on which she should complete her 16th year. "Father," said she with dream eyes, "I have never deceived you. If I live, I will return. But do not grieve too deeply should my heart break in this fearful struggle." The old hussar dashed away a tear which strayed down his scarred and sunburned cheek, embraced his child, and departed. Time wore gradually away, and at last the day arrived which was to seal Teresa's fate. It found her in a state of torpid despair. Exhausted by her previous struggles, all feeling seemed to be dead, but her mind was awakened to new suffering. A friend arrived to conduct her to her father. The good Ludovic apparently lay on the bed of death, and with breathless impatience Teresa pursued her journey. On her arrival, her father's sick room was not solitary. The detested Karl was there, and there too was the youthful hussar. "My child," said Ludovic, "my days are numbered. My fate must soon be decided, and alas, yours also. To my dying brother I solemnly promised that on this day I would offer you to his son for his bride. Without fulfilling my engagement I could not die in peace. Even the grave would afford no rest. Can you sacrifice yourself for my future repose?" "I can, I will," cried the unfortunate Teresa, sinking on her knees. "So help me heaven." "Heaven will bless a dutiful child," said Ludovic with fervour. "Karl, draw near." Karl obeyed. Teresa shuddered. "Karl," said Ludovic, "you say you love my child. Cherish her, I conjure you, as you hope for future happiness. In her you will possess a treasure, but I must warn you, she will bring you but one portion of my possessions." Karl started, and retreated a few steps. "That, however," continued Ludovic, "which I look upon as my greatest earthly treasure, I give you with my daughter. You, Karl, believe me to have some virtues. Alas, alas, you know not the secret sins which have sullied my life, the rapine, the murder. But enough of this. I have confessed to my ghostly father, and have obtained absolution for the dark catalogue, but on the condition that I leave all my wealth to the church, as an atonement for my transgressions. I could not forget I was a father. I pleaded the destitute state of my child. I implored, I entreated. At length I wrung from the pious father his consent that I should retain my greatest treasure for my Teresa. I chose my saddle. Keep it, dear child, in remembrance of an affectionate father. And you, Karl, are you satisfied to relinquish worldly good for my soul's health? Are you content to take my daughter with this portion?" "Fool!" exclaimed Karl. "Doting idiot! How dare you purchase exemption from punishment at my expense? Your wealth is mine. Your possessions should be the portion of my bride. I will reclaim them from those avaricious monks, and tear them from the altar." "You cannot, you dare not," replied Ludovic, raising his voice in anger. "My agreement with your father had reference to my daughter only. My wealth formed no part of it." "Driveller, dotard!" vociferated Karl. "Think you that I will accept of a portionless bride? You must seek some other fool for the purpose. I renounce her." "Give her to me, father," cried Arnold. "I swear to cherish and protect her while life is in my body. Give her to me, dear father, and when she shall be the loved wife of my bosom, I will live for her, ay, and die for her." Karl laughed in mockery. "You value life but lightly," said he, "when you talk of sacrificing it for a woman. I never knew one worth the trouble of winning, and least of all Teresa." The young hussar laid his hand on his sabre. Teresa threw herself between them. At the same moment Ludovic sprung from his couch, tore the covering from his head, snatched his saddle from the wall where it hung, seized his sabre, with one stroke laid it open, and a stream of golden bezants, oriental pearls, and sparkling jewels fell on the earth. "Wretch, worm, vile clod of the earth, art thou not justly punished? Hence, reptile, fly before I forget that thou art of my blood."
Ludovic raised his sabre, and the dastardly Karl fled, without daring to give utterance to the imprecation which hung on his colourless lips. Trampling under foot the costly jewels which lay strewed around, Teresa rushed forward and embraced her father, exclaiming, "Is not this a dream? Are you indeed restored to me? Can this bliss be real?" "Forgive me, my child," exclaimed Ludovic, "the pain I have been obliged to give your gentle heart. My effort to make that wretch resign his claim to your hand has been successful. Grudge not that a part of our store has been appropriated to the Holy Church, not to purchase forgiveness of the sins I enumerated, and of which, thank heaven, I am guiltless, but to be the blessed means of saving you from a miserable fate. Kneel down, my children. I support her, Arnold. Lay her innocent head on your bosom, and receive the fervent benediction of an old hussar." End of section 5.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, The Wages of Sin. For the ensuing narrative, I am indebted to the kindness of a friend who was tutor and executor to the wayward young man whose guilt and wretchedness it commemorates. Strange though the story may appear, there are those in existence who know it to be true. Why then should I withhold what the writer himself had destined for the world? There are none to be grieved at the disclosures it contains. Moiston left behind him no near relations. He had but one friend. Let then this unconnected record of sorrow and sin appear in his own words. At least it may serve to show that if in this checkered state of being, virtue and happiness are not synonymous terms, still misery is indissolubly allied to crime. I am dying, I know it, despite of all that medical skill can achieve, of every alleviation that art can suggest, and every check to disease that wealth can procure. I am rapidly sinking into my grave. Be it so. I grieve not at the discovery. Can the captive mourn the hour which will free him from the damp and loathsome dungeon, and open to him the joyous air of heaven? Oh no, the truest friend the wretched have is he who drops the scene upon their weary life. But let me not spend my few last fleeting hours in moralizing. I have yet much to do. Little has my past life availed my fellow creatures. Oh, let me benefit them from the grave, surrounded with every blessing which existence can afford, possessing prospects of a brilliant, nay, almost unrivalled nature. Few enter this checkered scene of being with greater advantages than myself. It is true that the lapse of a few short years made me an unconscious orphan, but by a kind and watchful guardian and his sister, who had been my mother's early friend, their place was most affectionately supplied, and of such a brother as I possessed, few could boast. He was about 18 months older than myself, and though in our pursuits and tastes and turns of thought an essential difference was perceptible, we were warmly and devotedly attached. Alone in the world, we clung to each other with an intensity of affection which orphans only can feel. I will describe him, though it cost me a bitter pang. More sedate, more reflecting, more refined and highly cultivated than myself, with a mind slightly tinged with melancholy, and deeply but unaffectedly impressed by the great truths of religion, he exhibited a character remarkable for mental energy when excited, but which took rare and sparing interest in ordinary occurrences. His pleasures were invariably those of a grave and solitary cast. He seemed to endure mirth rather than enjoy it, to enter into society more from a feeling of duty than an anticipation of amusement. To contemplate nature in her wildest and grandest forms, to listen to the sullen roar of ocean, to survey from the verge of a rock the fretful billows foaming and breaking at its base, to watch the progress of the tempest and gaze upon the forked lightning, to enjoy the Sabbath stillness of a summer's evening, and muse upon the starry firmament, studded with innumerable worlds, to investigate the structure and powers of the human mind, and to dive into sciences which lead man to his Maker, and force upon him the magnificence of the Deity and the extent of his benevolence. For pursuits like these he had the keenest relish, and from the prosecution of them he seemed daily to rise with fresh and unabated enjoyment, and in despite of an air of pensive gravity and reserve, unusual in one so happily circumstanced, there were few who were more generally and deservedly beloved than the young Sir Walter Moyston of Mountsfield. Oh, I did love him, gay, volatile, and impetuous, interested only about the present and careless of the future, governed far too frequently by the impulse of the heart, rather than by the decision of the head, often the victim of passion, ever the slave of caprice. Yet did I pay involuntary homage to my brother's superiority, and in every moment of difficulty, in every hour of trial, when disgust or disappointment or treachery had assailed me, I would turn to this highly gifted being and be comforted. What would I give to recall that period? I was happy, for I was innocent. When I first woke in the morning, I could almost weep with pleasure. The holy calm, the silence, the freshness, the fragrance would thrill through my soul. And then, yes, then I could lift a heart to heaven, which guilt had not torn from confidence in God. My brother was about 20, and I had just quitted Oxford, when an addition was made to our neighbourhood in the person of a Mrs. de Courcy. She was the widow of a very gallant officer, and the bravery of her husband, and the circumstance of his loss, reducing her from comfort and independence to the lowliest retirement and the scantiest pittance, added to her own noble descent and very superior manners, excited a powerful interest in her favour, and she was very generally courted on her appearance among us. Yet, amidst it all, she was a cold, calculating, mercenary being, an adept in intrigue, and a heartless manoeuvrer. In a word, she was a woman of the world, and could contrive at will to make vice appear virtue, and art seem innocence. She was accompanied by her daughter. Let me attempt to describe Adela de Courcy. I see her at this moment before me, that clear, fair forehead, that deep blue eye, that open, frank, confiding smile, that buoyant, airy step, that careless, nay, almost childish gaiety of manner, which seems so delightfully to mix with the everyday business of life, and to throw a glow of cheerfulness on all around her. No, to her description is injustice. To see and love this captivating being, to love against hope, against reason, to love with all the jealousy and despondence of a youthful heart, with all the intensity and devotion of a first affection, was very speedily mine. I say, to love against hope, against reason, for I discovered but too soon that Adela's beauty, her innocence, her misfortunes, and the air of cheerful resignation with which she submitted to their pressure, had made a powerful and permanent impression on my brother's heart. I saw that I had no chance, and yet Adela's return of her lover's passion was cold and faint in the extreme. Living in his immediate neighbourhood, hearing hour by hour of his unbounded benevolence, his unaffected piety, his humility, his disinterestedness, she respected, she esteemed, but no, she never loved him. To her mother, his wealth, his rank, his generous easy temper were irresistible. Mrs. de Courcy smiled upon his suit. I was a bankrupt in affection from that very hour. For the first time I now felt I was a younger brother. For the first time my heart swelled with envy and animosity toward the unsuspecting Walter. For the first time I regarded with feelings of satisfaction his slender form and sickly habit, treasured up the passing indications of delicacy of constitution, and calculated, yes, actually calculated, whether it was not possible I might survive him, and then better feelings would return, and I would oppose to those baneful but evanescent emotions my own purity of intention and rectitude of heart. 'Twas the dream of a madman, Oh, would to God I had learnt the lesson of human weakness, the great lesson of human life, that I had been taught the narrow limits of human sufficiency, and had been led to pray for strength and support from above. Would to God I had learnt to control my passions, to subjugate them to the empire of reason, to invoke divine assistance, to combat, to stifle, to subdue them. I get weaker, I must on. Preparations for the marriage were in progress. Instructions had been issued for the settlements, and the ceremony stood fixed for the day on which my brother would attain his minority. The feelings of my mind strangely harmonized with the season of the year. It was far advanced in autumn. The dew lay thick upon the grass. The landscape was entirely shrouded with vapor, excepting where a solitary sunbeam seemed to struggle with the mist. The woods were silent, and not a single sign of life enlivened the monotony of the scene, save where the dusky livery of a huge old fir was contrasted by the brilliant berries of the mountain ash. It was nature in her sepulchre. My brother challenged me to a walk on a morning cheerless and gloomy as that which I have been describing. I was sure the invitation contemplated some particular object, nor was I mistaken. He announced to me in form his intended marriage, spoke to me most confidentially, most unreservedly, unfolded all his plans for the present, his prospects for the future, apprised me in the most delicate terms of the addition which he had deemed it right to make to a younger brother's portion, and again assured me that neither time nor circumstances could effect the slightest diminution in his love. Engaged in earnest conversation, we had reached a ravine in the grounds. It was a spot sad and solitary, but wild and picturesque in the extreme. Ivy mantled its sides in some places, and in others oaks and holly bushes, whose roots found nourishment in the crevices of the rock, excluded the light of day, and half concealed the torrent which foamed below. The weeping willow and the mournful cypress waved o'er the waters. At a little distance lower down, the stream, now brawling and foaming in hasty current, now whirling in deep and circular eddies, was joined by a sluggish and slumbering rivulet, and became a very considerable sheet of water. Its depth, even at the side, was upward of 15 feet. Heedlessly loitering on the brink and pointing to some recent improvements, my brother faltered and fell into the flood. The slightest motion on my part would have saved him. The least effort, without incurring any risk, any danger to myself, would have been sufficient to avert his fate. The very sapling which lay on the grass beside me, had it been guided to his grasp, would have drawn him to the brink. I stood motionless. The feelings of a fiend rushed over me and prevailed. Twice he rose and struggled manfully with the torrent. I saw his face, almost black with agony. I caught his eye fixed full upon me with an expression of anxiety, of entreaty, of reproach and despair, which impending dissolution only could convey. A convulsive cry escaped him. It was repeated in a deeper, wilder tone. A sullen plunge was heard. There was stillness around me. It was the stillness of death. I returned to the house by a long and circuitous route, and immediately on reaching it gave the alarm. His body was found an hour afterward. I did not see it. I was pressed to do so, but replied they were the only words of truth that passed my lips for many years, that my feelings would not allow me. Within 2 years afterward, Adela was mine. I had now realized the wildest wish of my heart. Sin I had committed, aggravated, heinous, damning, overwhelming. I had earned fairly its wages. Fortune was mine. Rank was mine. The being I had so long and so hopelessly loved was mine. There was no living creature to dispute my will, nor control my wishes. Perhaps it may be asked, was I happy? Happy? From the very day my brother died, I never knew the meaning of the term. Soon, very soon, retribution overtook me. The Almighty visited me early with his chastisements. I was passionately fond of children. There was a purity and an innocence about them which breathed to me of another world. I liked them as companions. Their heartful mirth, their sportive playfulness, their dove-like simplicity and winning smiles would always, even in my darkest hours, steal me from myself. I implored heaven, for I dared to pray, to vouchsafe me such a blessing of my own. There were other reasons which rendered me earnest and importunate in this petition. I was the last of my race. The name of Moyston, so nobly descended, the title of no recent creation, would die with me. The extensive domains would, in that case, enrich a family who had already aggrandized themselves at our expense, and whose very mention was hateful to me, for those powerful reasons, independent of my passionate attachment to infancy. I was anxious beyond description for a living representative. Years rolled on. I was childless. Conscience gradually resumed her sway. The figure of my drowning brother pursued me like a shadow. Night and day, at home and abroad, in society and in solitude, his image was before me. My health began to show symptoms of decay. Medical science was resorted to. My attendant pronounced me nervous, hypochondriacal, recommended change of air, of scene, hurried me off to Brighton, to Cheltenham, and prescribed tonic medicines and nutritious diet. Pshaw! I despised their prognostics. I laughed to scorn their self-sufficient ignorance and the confidence with which they boasted of their ability to cure. My malady was beyond their art, and I knew it. My symptoms were a wounded conscience. My sufferings arose from the anguish of remorse. My feverish days and restless nights had their origin in those bitter feelings of self-reproach, which, like the vulture of Prometheus, preyed unceasingly upon my vitals, and were but too lively an emblem of the worm that never dies. After a melancholy sojourn at Malvern, Harrogate, Buxton, and half a dozen other places sacred to folly and fashion, I returned to Mountsfield with a decided increase of malady. It had now reached such a height that I was unable to encounter a human eye. I insisted with the vehemence of frenzy no servant should presume to meet me, no matter what might be the urgency of the errand, no matter what might be its importance. On pain of instant dismission, I enjoined them to retrace their steps. Lady Moyston reasoned, remonstrated, entreated, in vain. I adopted the jargon of my physician, and laid the blame on the total derangement of my nervous system. Dr. Warren, he's now in his grave, commended my prudent precaution. Prudence, precaution, ha, ha, ha! I could not, I dare not meet the steady gaze even of the menials that surrounded me. I dreaded, I anticipated, they would read the guilty secret in my careworn, haggard countenance. I was obeyed to the very letter. I could wander at will through the grounds without meeting a human being. I could traverse the long gallery at Mountsfield, pace up and down, to and fro, in the splendid but deserted apartments, and muse, unchecked by the presence or even the sound of any living witness, over my ever-increasing anguish, compunction, and despair. Sleep forsook me. That clear, sweet, soft voice forever rung in my ears. I heard it above the swell of the pealing organ, above the waves of the ocean as they rolled in thunder on the shore, in the silence of midnight, in the glare of noonday, in the song, in the dance, go where I would, still an invisible monitor sounded in my ears. Henry, dear Henry, save me, save me. I endeavored to soothe my wounded spirit by acts of the most unbounded charity. I would fain have bribed heaven by a life of the most extensive benevolence. To the needy, the suffering, the aged, and the diseased, I dispensed my wealth liberally, largely. Alas, light where it would, it seemed followed by a curse. The objects of my bounty proved unworthy, or ungrateful, or impostors, or importunate. Few, very few, appeared on examination deserving or necessitous, and the blessings which these invoked on my head seemed to my distempered imagination expressions of the bitterest derision, and the heartfelt aspirations which they uttered, that I might never know what sorrow was, seemed the exultations of a fiend that mocked at my calamity and laughed at my despair. Months had I continued in this feverish state of being, when an incident occurred which diverted the current of my thoughts, and had afterward a very material influence upon my destiny. In one of my solitary rambles through the park, I found a little boy, cold, hungry, and almost destitute of clothing, watching with the most affectionate solicitude, and weeping over a dying mother. She was a soldier's wife, who, having lost her husband, was returning to her native village, when disease had arrested her progress. She was indeed hastening to her final home. Her little companion, I may say, comforter, was a noble, manly-looking boy of 5 years old, with a face which had without exception the finest, softest, sweetest expression I ever saw. He was sitting by her side with a look of childish, helpless anguish, and the tone in which his little clear voice murmured, "Don't cry, mother, don't cry," as he wiped the damps of death from her brow, touched a heart cold, churlish, and insensible as mine. She was carefully removed to the house. Every remedy that experience could suggest, every comfort that wealth could procure, was afforded her. It availed but little. Death would not be cheated of his prey, and his approach hourly became more perceptible. The little mourner watched every turn of her disorder with a glistening eye and quivering lip, sat hour after hour with his little hand clasped in hers, and when the last struggle came on, and we forcibly excluded him from the chamber, he fixed himself on the step outside the door, inquired in faltering accents of all who entered or quitted the apartment, and as each reply became more hopeless than the former, wept in silence. When he told him of his poor mother's death, he refused food. No delicacy we could offer could tempt his appetite. He sat by the coffin in childish sorrow, and mourned as one that would not be comforted. There was something in this homage of the heart which deeply interested me. I will keep him, educate him, provide for him. He at least will love me. The flame of gratitude will burn bright and clear in such an affectionate bosom, and on him, bound to me by the ties of countless obligations, the rumours of the world will have no power. His profession shall be that of his choice. How these daydreams were realized will appear hereafter. The passing stimulus of the moment over, my mind made by respecting the education of the little orphan, and every arrangement for his comfort completed, my thoughts gradually returned into their old channel, and some slightly exciting cause was all that was requisite to bring back my malady with renewed violence. It was not long wanting. I had taken pleasure in going to church. Yes, unaccountable as it may appear, my happiest hours by far were those which I spent there. I could and did pray. I felt the beauties and was alive to the unction of our incomparable liturgy, and if I ever had an interview free from the gnawings of remorse, it was when I was under the roof of my God. This confession may appear extraordinary. I care not. It is true. Touched by a passage of Scripture, by some brief but exquisite reference, in the state of my own mind, softened by the calm, the holy stillness of the sanctuary, or subdued by the plaintive persuasions of the good old man who counselled there, I have wept, often bitterly, wept as I thought of that heaven from which I felt myself eternally excluded, wept as I thought of that fearful account to which I so unrelentingly consigned my generous brother, wept as I reflected on what I might have been and what I was. Yet these were not tears of penitence. I knew not the meaning of contrition, and from everything resembling confession of my guilt and supplication for pardon, my proud spirit revolted together. No, such was the conclusion at which I invariably arrived. No pity for me. The human being does not exist to whom I would breathe my secret. The mental gangrene which preys upon me may corrode my heart's core, but I will carry it with me to the grave. I wander. I have said my happiest hours were those which were spent in the exercise of public devotion. This interval of enjoyment was not long permitted me. On Easter Sunday I have as vivid a recollection of the time and place and circumstances as though it had been an affair of yesterday. I chanced to catch Mr. Allen's eye resting upon me as he slowly read in his deep solemn tones, "Thou shalt not murder." I was instantly unnerved. I could detect a deeper, graver modulation than usual, could trace in his penetrating eye a peculiar expression, a point and severity in his generally mild and gentle manner. He suspected me. Did he dare? I would brave him. I could not. I was at church for the last time. My malady now returned with tenfold violence. I was unable to bear the presence even of my own servants. I insisted upon their never presuming to look at me as they waited at dinner, upon their eye constantly and invariably shunning me. I will not, said I, with the tone and gesture of a madman, be bearded by menials in my own hall, but consider, my love, said Lady Morstan, the endless, the unaccountable constructions which such a command would bear. No matter, said I, with increasing vehemence, I will be obeyed. Certainly, Henry, was Adela's reply. Certainly, your will, you know, is ever mine. Suppose then we dispense with their attendance altogether. I myself, said she, with her own sweet smile, will wait upon you. Will you accept of me for a cupbearer? The idea pleased me. I adopted it, but after a while I had the misery of perceiving that even Adela's presence was a painful restraint upon me. I proposed dining alone. She struggled with her tears and acquiesced. Marcius, for so I had named the little orphan, was now 18. In him I fancied I should find an ample recompense for the bitter disappointment, vexation, and chagrin which had attended all my former schemes of benevolence. Oh, he did promise fair. In attainments and disposition, in person and in manner, he was all that I could wish. Hourly did I congratulate myself upon the incident which had enabled me to foster such generosity of character, such originality of mind. I was anxious he should be near me. I urged him to direct his thoughts toward the church. In him I felt assured my fancy portrait of a country clergyman would find a living illustration. 'Twas not to be. The plumed troop and spirit-stirring drum had captivated his young and ardent temperament, and I, unwilling to thwart his choice, interested myself in procuring him a commission. I was successful. The conscientious but not slavish adherence with which our family had for years supported government measures was admitted and acknowledged, and after a little delay I received a letter acquainting me that an ensigncy in the foot was at my service. As early in the morning as I felt myself equal to the interview, I summoned Marcius to hear the gratifying intelligence. He came not. Another messenger was dispatched. There was an unusual delay, a hesitation, an embarrassment I could neither understand nor tolerate. I got irritated. I was then told that Mr. Beresford was nowhere to be found. After an interval, I learned that he had quitted Mountsfield immediately after breakfast, and at last that Lady Moyston had accompanied him. My cup of sorrow was now filled to the brim. The curse of a justly offended God was tracking my footsteps. His wrath had overruled my darling project, crushed my proudest hopes. The only beings that loved me, that cared for me, had abandoned me to my fate. I was now to struggle alone, unpitied and unheeded, into my grave. She left me, but I will not blame her. Kind, light-hearted, affectionate being, how could I expect she would love one so gloomy, so churlish, so selfish, and misanthropic as myself? No, I will not blame her. I deserve her not. Standing on the brink of eternity, I will permit no unkind feeling to mingle with my last recollections of one who was for many years so very dear to me. Thou wilt find, Adela, that in my testamentary disposition thou art not forgotten, and mayest thou be forgiven at the bar of heaven as fully and as freely as I forgive thee now. I copy her last letter. It reached me a few hours after her departure. It is but justice to herself that I should give it. To Sir Henry Moyston. I have left you forever. For years I have been laboring under the agonizing conviction that I no longer possessed your confidence. In vain have I scrutinized my conduct to see where I had failed in duty or affection. I cannot discover, and you will not point out, how I have forfeited your esteem. I can struggle with it no longer. Your coldness, your indifference, your cruel neglect have cut me to the soul. But farewell. I have taken nothing with me but what was strictly my own. The pittance which I inherited from my poor mother, and a few articles of personal property, dear to me as having once been hers, are all I have appropriated to myself. My jewels, my wardrobe, my valuables of every description I have left behind. To them I felt I had no claim. May the future years of your life make amends for the misery which has embittered the past. Yet remember, when left at liberty by divorce to make another choice, that domestic happiness must be founded in domestic confidence. Adela. I could not sleep alone. Wake when I would, I was in agony. The silent and gloomy ravine was continually before me. I heard the roar of the torrent at a distance, the sullen plash of the waters as he sunk forever, saw the supplicating agony of his countenance as he struggled with his fate, caught the echo of his last convulsive shriek for help. I could count the bubbles as the air escaped from his lungs and rose to the surface of the water. Hubert, my own valet, occupied my dressing-room. I must in my sleep have betrayed my secret, or he, waked by my agony, overheard and understood me. Be that as it may, speedily and bitterly did he make me feel his power. Not a syllable ever escaped him. He was silent as the grave, but his insolent air, his arrogant manner, soon gave me to understand the knowledge he had acquired, and from that hour he never ceased to exercise a thraldom over me which has crushed me to the dust. I dreaded him, I dared not command him, and in the midst of luxury, in my own almost princely mansion, with a fortune not many could equal, and a retinue few could boast, I felt what it was to be a slave. The blow has been struck 2 days since. Unable to submit to Hubert's increasing insolence of manner, and irritated by disease, I ventured to reprimand him sharply, and to hint that were he to obtain his deserts, it would be a free passage from Mountsfield. If every one got his due, where would you be? There was a gibbet in my country 20 years since stood quite close to my mother's cottage. It was that of a man who was hung for the murder of his only brother. I fell back on my chair, covered with blood. I had ruptured a blood vessel. I am thankful I've been spared to complete my narrative. To conclude it, I have written till midnight. The wind whistles wildly around me. Hark again, it comes borne on the blast. Henry, dear Henry, save me, save me. A few hours, and I enter upon the world of spirits. God of compassion, pity me, the victim of impulse, the slave of ill-regulated passions, guilty and debased and degraded as I am. Oh, remember that for me, yes, even for me, a Saviour died. End of section 6.
Section 7 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. An Inkling of an Adventure. I sat tossing pebbles into Lake George on a fine summer morning in June, 10 or 12 years ago, say about the introduction of the black cravat and the beginning of the reign of King William. The ripples just feathered with the wind and no more. A swan with his wings spread would have rounded the point of Isle Diamond in half an hour, a standard mile. It was in other respects as lovely a morning as the lark at Heaven's Gate ever heralded. "What a ferry boat!" she shot suddenly out from a small cove above me, a white, slender, aerial thing, with a deep green band through her waist, her sails snowy and all set, and a pink streamer from either mast running away in long curves from the wind, and flaunting most gracefully. At her helm sat a lady, and as I caught a glimpse of a dark eye under her bonnet, she leaned forward just so far as to show an exquisite figure in relief, and putting down the tiller, ran right for the point where I was sitting. A minute more, and the sharp bow grated on the pebbles, and the shadow of the little topmast passed over my feet. I rose and looked around for the object of their visit. I was on the bank alone, no one within sight. What could they mean by running down on me so pointedly? Before I had time to wonder twice, a young man, of 16 apparently, who had been held from view by the mainsail, leaped ashore and raised his hat with a very courteous "Good morning. You seem to be alone, sir. Will you honor us with your company up the lake?" "Certainly, sir, with all my heart. But," and as I hesitated, I looked inquisitively at an elderly gentleman who had risen from the windward seat in the stern, and stood looking at us with a smile. "My son's invitation is rather abrupt, sir," said he, bowing in answer to my look, "but I beg you will accept it notwithstanding. We are losing the morning breeze. Will you step on board?" A single leap, and my foot was on the taffrail. "Stop!" said the lady, springing up from the tiller, and motioning me back with her hand. Her voice was enough to set you dreaming the rest of your life. "One condition, as I ran the shallop down for you without permission of these two gentlemen, who, by the way, have the honor to stand for my father and brother. I claim the right to make it. Do you agree?" She nodded to us all, and I bowed my assent. "We are bound to some of those lovely islands, and as far up as the wind will take us, to idle away the day. You see, sir," addressing me, "are to have the honor of my society and special protection as commander of the boat, till I set you on the bank again at sunset. Promising, however, before these gentlemen, that you will ask us no personal questions whatever during the voyage, and make no inquiries of our name and whereabout after you have left us. This sacrifice of curiosity I consider necessary to my maidenly delicacy, otherwise compromised, perhaps, by this whimsical assault upon a stranger." I had been left at the hotel that morning by a large party, who, after coming down the lake in the steamboat, 30 miles through the rain, and all the time passed in the cabin, were content to rise at daylight and take coach for the Springs, without waiting even an hour or two to see the most beautiful sheet of water in the world by sunshine. I had been hurried from Niagara, and dragged past 1,000 isles, and deprived of all but a mere glimpse of Montmorency, but to leave Lake George in such a grocer's hurry, without touching one of its green islands, or looking once into its strangely transparent depth by a clear sky. It was the drop too much. I was missing when the coach drove up, and they went without me. There was no other visitor at the lonely hotel, and when the wheels were out of hearing, I felt for the first time in a month the luxury of solitude. The sails filled, and away we shot from the shore, the beautiful shallop stealing through the water, as if, like the boat of the Witch of Atlas, some fairy influence had lit a living spark within all its frame, breathing the soul of swiftness into it. I sat between the fair skipper and her father, in a dream of bewilderment. Their manner put one perfectly at ease, and the conversation went on as swimmingly as the keel, every topic heightened and freshened inexpressibly by the mystery of the acquaintance. There was no danger of a betrayal even of name, for they called each other by the familiar appellation, and Constance and Arthur and Papa soon became as used to my ears as if I had known them intimately from my boyhood. I think I am in for a description. I don't very well see how I can let you off without it. If I were to report the gay conversation around the tiller, it would not be at all the same thing as a sweet-toned bagatelle of a voice, like a disguised enchanter's. And as I forget everything I said myself, and only remember here and there an observation of Mr. Arthur and his venerable father, there would be a precious probability that 2/3 of the dialogue would be clear fancy, a quality I wish particularly to avoid in this narration. A description of the lake will both eke out the story and save me from the dilemma. You shall have it. Imprimis, it is the most beautiful lake in America, and, sequitur, the most beautiful spot in the world. Its 30 miles of length are more like a river than a lake, a river with mountain banks, its bosom studded with small green islands, covered with the most lavish verdure and foliage, and its waters as clear and transparent almost as the atmosphere. You may see the long heavy pickerel moving drowsily about on the bottom at the depth of 30 feet, and the shoals of smaller fish scudding across your bow, and count the rocks and white crystals with which the lake abounds, as distinctly as if the element were not water, but air. Then the wooded shores are so near and so bold, and the islands are so many and so buried in leaves, that as your boat runs through the narrow channels, it seems to you as if you were floating among clouds. The shadows in the water of rock and tree and outline are such faultless resemblances, like Wordsworth's swan, every gem of an island floats double, isle and shadow. And as you put out from the little pier at Caldwell, the place of the hotel at the south end of the lake, and pull away with a couple of smart oars for the north, islet after islet, not much larger than a parlor ottoman, steals out to your view. And so you may voyage on, hours and hours, spattering at every dip, almost, some fairy shore, till your mind absolutely becomes surfeited with beauty. And with these general features, I leave the rest to your imagination. The breeze died away in the middle of the forenoon, and left us with our sails flapping against the mast, opposite a small island, fringed with beeches and carpeted with short, rich grass and moss, the prettiest flower for fairy feet in the world. At the bidding of our fair helmsman, I took an oar with Arthur, and 3 or 4 fair pulls brought us alongside, and covered the boat with the overhanging branches. The shade was deep and cool, and we spread the contents of a certain ambiguous-looking hamper on the cloth, and setting bottles of claret and champagne down by a rock in the water, prepared to picnic in the most rural insouciance. Oh, those 3 or 4 or 5 hours! I don't know how long. They flew like hours in paradise. I was happier than I could expect to be again, and that superb creature, perfectly frank and half gay, half thoughtful, now running to the shore edge for a flower, now noting some exquisite effect of light or shadow, laughing, moralizing, quoting poetry, and glancing at sentiment, everything unstudied and everything in taste. She was enough to ruin a whole academy of cynics. We dined at the primitive hour of 12, and spent the afternoon in reading and lounging, and at 8, just as the moon was rising, we embarked, and on a perfectly glassy surface, rowed slowly back to Caldwell. Our lovely skipper groaned a little penseroso, and mingling passages of songs with low-toned, beautiful conversation, more interesting and bewitching with every change of her humor. We touched the pier. They looked at me with a smile. I was about breaking my promise, and she put her finger on her lip, and with a heart almost sick with regret, I shook hands hastily with them all, and sprang on shore. "Push off," she said, in a tone of gaiety. I looked at her as the gay word sounded harshly in my ear, and with something in her eye which I have the vanity to believe would have been a tear in a moment she met my look, and smiled half sadly, and with a kiss of her white hand, turned away to the sway of the shallop. I have never heard of them since. The landlord remarked that they were boarding privately at a farmhouse a mile back in the country, and that is all I know of them. They were people of the first cultivation, and the highest tone of breeding and courtesy I ever met. I hope some day to see them, but after traveling through all the northern and middle cities since, and going much into society, but seeing no trace of them, I almost despair. I have recorded our delightful rencontre in the hope that it may reach their eye. If it should, and they will send but a card to me, through the editor of this polite periodical, it will be the happiest hour I have known since I saw them, in which I pack my valise for a journey. It is my lot in life. Everything comes to me fragmented and imperfect. I have encountered hundreds of these mere inklings of romance. Every stage-coach, steamboat, canal, every hotel in a strange city gives me some beginning to an adventure. There is no denouement. I am a sort of traveling Tantalus. I shall die some day of sheer wonder. End of Section 7. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Molehill Mountain. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. The Passing Crowd. The passing crowd is a phrase coined in the spirit of indifference. Yet to a man of what Plato calls universal sympathies, and even to the plain, ordinary denizens of this world, what can be more interesting than the passing crowd? Does not this tide of human beings, which we daily see passing along the ways of this world, consist of persons animated by the same spark of the divine essence, and partaking of the same high destinies with ourselves? Let us stand still but for a moment in the midst of this busy and seemingly careless scene, and consider what they are or may be whom we see around us. In the hurry of the passing show, and of our own sensations, we see but a series of unknown faces, but this is no reason why we should regard them with indifference. Many of these persons, if we knew their histories, would rivet our admiration by the ability, worth, benevolence, or piety which they have displayed in their various paths through life. Many would excite our warmest interest by their sufferings perhaps borne meekly and well, and more for the sake of others than themselves. How many tales of human weal and woe, of glory and of humiliation, could be told by these beings whom, in passing, we regard not? Unvalued as they are by us, how many as good as ourselves repose upon them the affections of bounteous hearts, and would not want them for any earthly compensation? Every one of these persons, in all probability, retains in his bosom the cherished recollections of early happy days, spent in some scene which they ne'er forget, though there they are forgot, with friends and fellows who, though now far removed in distance and in fortune, are never to be given up by the heart. Every one of these individuals, in all probability, nurses still deeper in the recesses of feeling the remembrance of that chapter of romance in the life of every man, an early, earnest attachment conceived in the fervor of youth, unstained by the slightest thought of self, and for the time purifying and elevating the character far above its ordinary standard. Beneath all this gloss of the world, this cold, conventional aspect, which all more or less present, and which the business of life renders necessary, there resides for certain a fountain of goodness, pure in its inner depths as the lymph rock distilled, and ready on every proper occasion to well out in the exercise of the noblest duties. Though all may seem but a hunt after worldly objects, the great majority of these individuals can, at the proper time, cast aside all earthly thoughts, and communicate directly with the being whom their fathers have taught them to worship, and whose will and attributes have been taught to man immediately by himself. Perhaps many of these persons are loftier of aspect than ourselves, and belong to a sphere removed above our own. But, nevertheless, if the barrier of mere worldly form were taken out of the way, it is probable that we could interchange sympathies with these persons as freely and cordially as with any of our own class. Perhaps they are of an inferior order, but they are only inferior in certain circumstances, which should never interpose to prevent the flow of feeling for our kind. The great common features of human nature remain, and let us never forget how much respect is due to the very impressive humanity, the type of the divine nature itself. Even where our fellow creatures are degraded by vice and poverty, let us still be gentle in our judging. The various fortunes which we every day see befalling the members of a single family, after they part off in their several paths through life, teach us that it is not to everyone that success in the career of existence is destined. Besides, do not the arrangements of society at once necessitate the subjection of an immense multitude to humble toil, and give rise to temptations before which the weak and uninstructed can scarcely escape falling? But even beneath the soiled face of the poor artisan there may be aspirations after some vague excellence, which hard fate has denied him the means of attaining, though the very wish to obtain it is itself ennobling. The very mendicant was not always so. He, too, has had his undergraded and happier days, upon the recollection of which some remnant of better feeling may still repose. These, I humbly think, are reasons why we should not look with coldness upon any masses of men with whom it may be our lot to mingle. It is the nature of a good man to conclude that others are like himself, and if we take the crowd promiscuously, we can never be far wrong in thinking that there are worthy and well-directed feelings in it, as well as in our own bosoms. It is Shakespeare's peculiar excellence that throughout the whole of his splendid picture gallery, the reader will excuse the confessed inadequacy of this metaphor, we find individuality everywhere, mere portrait nowhere. In all its various characters, we still feel ourselves communing with the same human nature, which is everywhere present as the vegetable sap in the branches, sprays, leaves, buds, blossoms, and fruits, their shapes, tastes, and odors. End of Section 8. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 11. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.